afternoon. I'm Francis Levy. Ed Dursessian and I are co-directors of the Philoctetes Center, and welcome to Poetry and Narrative. There's always a big hue and outcry about the fact that I forget to announce that there are books by our distinguished panelists, and so everyone get up now and buy your books. I just want to make sure that people buy books. You should buy these books. And we wish to thank the New York State Council on the Humanities, the Department of Cultural Affairs, and NYSCA, for the New York State Council on the Arts, for supporting this particular event. Now, before we continue with the afternoon's panel, I wanted to make a couple of announcements. First of all, this show you see is from our Art of the Graphic Novel panel, and features work by James Sturm, Ben Couture, Tracy White, and others, and it was curated by Holly Cohn with Adam Ludwig, and it's a fascinating show. It's been up for a while, but it's a show that you read, really. You literally read, you look and you read, and if you take time out, it's something not to be missed. Tomorrow, our popular jazz improvisation series continues, Living in the Musical Moment, and we have Ken Wessel talking about improvisation and jazz guitar. So Ken Wessel is quite well known. In fact, a writer friend of mine, Jay Neugeborn, some of you may know, takes lessons with him, and he's going to come too, so see his teacher. Our film series continues on February 25th, very exciting. Max Ophuls' Letter to an Unknown Woman. Some of you may remember that movie, starring Joan Fontaine and Louis Jourdan, and based upon a Stefan Zweig novel. And that movie was picked out by Tom McCarthy, the novelist, author of Remainder, who was shortlisted for the Man Booker this year for C, and he's going to be here. Remainder is a fascinating novel. I recommend it to you, and I haven't read C, so I can't say anything about that. But that should be a very provocative, interesting panel. And he's also, along with Simon Critchley, a founder of the Neo-Nautical Society, which is a proto-Dadaist group. This should be something that you don't want to miss. Our Big Question series continues on February 26th with the limitations of physical and mental reality. Gregory Chaitin, the discoverer of the Omega number, will be on the panel with Tim Maudlin, professor of philosophy at Rutgers, and Ed Nelson, professor of math at Princeton and author of Quantum Fluctuations, Predicative Arithmetic. And Ed Nelson has been here before. On March 1st, poetry returns with From Homer to 2011, Greek Poetry Through the Millennia. A small topic. On March 12th, Big Questions continues again with Theories of Everything, which will include Gareth Williams, who was here on our Origins of Tragedy panel, and he's going to be talking about Lucretius's De Rerum Natura. Now, that is also a big area, but we're approaching Theories of Everything from the Greeks, the initial seminal formulations of attempts to understand nature, to quantum mechanics, and we have one of the panelists is physicist Herman Verlinde from Princeton, who will be discussing string theory. So we have we're encompassing a huge span of time and hoping to distill relevant ideas from that. But it's really the personalities of the panelists that often throw light on these kinds of topics. So I look forward to that. All Philoctetes events are simulcast, and you can see them approximately 3 days after they occur by going to www.philoctetes.org. And also, all our events are on YouTube, so you can see them there, and they get hundreds of thousands of hits. And I want to say to that end that we need your support to continue going. We really need your support. We get supported by public agencies in terms of the exact panels that we run, but our infrastructure is not supported by any of the agencies, and hence we depend on the patronage of our following. Without further ado, I am pleased to present Heather Dubrow. Heather Dubrow is John D. Boyd, S.J. I forgot the S.J. last time I was here. I feel badly about that.
He turned over in his grave. What can I tell you?
I always have trouble, with these kind of Jesuitical. Chair in the Poetic Imagination at Fordham University and director of the Poets Out Loud reading series. She is the author of 6 scholarly books, most recently The Challenges of Orpheus, Lyric Poetry and Early Modern England. A collection of poetry, Forms and Hollows, is forthcoming from WordPress.
Just published. Hot off the presses.
Okay, and it's going to be out here.
Yes.
Yeah, we should buy them. Yeah, I will. Other publications include a co-edited collection of essays, 2 chapbooks of poetry, and articles on early modern literature and on teaching, as well as poems in numerous Journals. What are some of the journals you've had poems in?
Southern Review, Southwest Review, Prairie Schooner, Journal of the American Medical Association.
Journal of the American Medical Association.
Yes.
I love that. I love it. Current projects include a book on the academic profession and a revisionist study of immediacy in lyric poetry, focusing especially on spatiality and temporality. Heather Dubrow will moderate this afternoon's panel and introduce our other guests, one of whom, Marilyn Nelson, is on the way. On the train.
Yes, exactly.
Or about to get off the train.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Heather.
Thank you very much, Francis. First of all, is my mic working now? Yeah, okay, great. We've brought together poets, literary critics, and people like me who wear both hats to discuss the issues suggested in our title, Poetry and Narrative. That seemingly straightforward title, in fact, gestures towards why these questions are difficult, controversial, fraught. Poetry and narrative, but how do we define, how do we describe, how do we distinguish not only poetry and narrative, but many different types of poetry? For that matter, should the title be Poetry or Narrative, as some of the work of Jonathan Culler might suggest? And if we think of it instead as poetry as narrative, how, why, when do poets either write poems that are unabashedly narrative, like the Frost poem Out Out that Jim Phelan is going to be talking about, or poems that incorporate, riff on narrative, like the Shakespeare sonnet I'll be discussing, or like some of Willie Perdomo's own poems. We've invited all the members of the panel to spark our discussion by talking for about 6-7 minutes, no more, on one narrative poem and reading it aloud, suggesting how it introduces questions about narrative. Then we'll have a discussion among ourselves about narrative. The poets on the panel will read, and then we'd like to throw it open to you and look forward to your participation. I'll introduce our panelists in alphabetical order. Each of them will speak in alphabetical order, but I'll go last because I figure at that point you've heard my voice a lot. Jonathan Culler is class of 1916 professor of English and comparative literature at Cornell University. He has arguably done more than any other critic of his generation to introduce major new theoretical movements, notably structuralism, deconstruction, and semiotics, to students and professors in this country, while also developing powerful reinterpretations of those movements. Of particular relevance to this panel is his study of apostrophe, that is, a type of address that reaches towards something not alive or not present, such as Marilyn Nelson's splendidly playful "Oh, catfish and turnip greens, hot water, cornbread, and grits." Apostrophe, Culler influentially, though not uncontroversially, maintains, distinguishes poetry, the mode where it thrives, from narrative. These and other seminal ideas have been developed in studies of 19th century French literature, especially Flaubert and Baudelaire, and in his influential books on contemporary literary theory and criticism, notably Structuralist Poetics, Saussure, On Deconstruction, and Literary Theory, a very short introduction, which has been translated into about 20 languages. In recent years, Jonathan Culler has been working especially on lyric poetry and is completing a book on Baudelaire and another on the theory of the lyric. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Heather. It's a pleasure to be here at the Philoctetes Center, which I never visited before, and I'm very impressed at the programs you have and the great range of activities that go on here, and hope to return soon. But for poetry and narrative. In a book entitled Feeling as a Foreign Language, The Good Strangeness of Poetry, really a wonderful title, the poet Alice Fulton writes, "Fiction is about what happens next. Poetry is about what happens now." So that's the soundbite version of my remarks this afternoon. Fiction is about what happens next. Poetry is about what happens now. Now, obviously, there are narrative poems. That's not in question. But I do think that the fundamental tension between the lyric impulse and the narrative impulse, and that in general, lyric poetry, a category within which I include short poems that deploy anecdote and incident, that in general lyric poetry aspires to be itself an event rather than to represent events or to be a narration of events. So, and I think as narrative fiction has become increasingly the center of literary experience for students and for general readers, it's important that we who are interested in the lyric foreground all the ways in which lyric differs from narrative, rather than attempt to have poetry compete with narrative on its own ground, which I think could be deadly. Lyric's formal resources and its conventions, history of its conventions enable it to do quite different things from narrative, and so that if narrative is indeed about what happens next, lyric can be about what happens now. It has special resources for foregrounding that now, the time in which readers engage the lyric. So I'd like to look at a poem that's unquestionably lyric, but with a clear little narrative element that might help us think about that relation. It's one of Goethe's most famous Lieds, known today above all in Schubert's setting. A beautiful setting, but I should say that I think in his setting the second verse of the refrain is too gay and lilting. Was lined up there, Haydn. It's not a jaunty poem, but the setting makes it into a little jaunty little poem here. So, excuse my German for those of you. Sah ein Knab ein Röslein stehen, Röslein auf der Heiden, war so jung und morgenschön, lief schnell es nah zu sehen, saß mit vielen Freuden. Röslein, Röslein, Röslein rot, Röslein auf der Heiden. Knabe sprach, ich breche dich, Röslein auf der Heiden. Röslein sprach, ich steche dich, dass du ewig denkst an mich, und ich will's nicht leiden. Röslein, Röslein, Röslein rot, Röslein auf der Heiden. Und der wilde Knabe brach es Röslein auf der Heiden. Röslein wehrte sich und stach, half ihm doch kein Weh, und ach, muss es eben leiden. Röslein, Röslein, Röslein rot, Röslein auf der Heiden. So this poem takes the form of a brief narrative recounted in the past, a sort of anecdote recounted in the past, very common lyric structure. Here we have the first stanza, an initial situation of pleasurable contemplation, in the second stanza a threat and the answering counter-threat, and then in the third stanza the carrying out of the first threat and the reprisal. Since the poem doesn't go on to reflect on what's happened, as lyrics often do, lyrics with this structure frequently then pull back and reflect on the significance of the events. Still, we might think that we are left in this narrative, the time and space of this narrative. But I think the address to the rose and its response, of course, give the narrative a different cast. And above all, the refrain, the repetition of the refrain has the effect of attaching this story to the present time of lyric discourse in which the rose is repeatedly invoked. So refrain is a very important constituent of lyric. First, of course, it's an instance of that kind of repetition that Roman Jakobson defined took to define the poetic function of language. That so it will be through repetition, equivalence becomes the constitutive device of the sequence. Things are chosen to be put together because they are repetitions at one level or another. But above all, refrain works to disrupt a narrative temporality and to pull us out of that temporality into this atemporal present of discourse in a time of enunciation. So it's through refrain, for example, that the ballad tries to become lyric, tries to remain even though it's deploying narrative structures. So, and one of the fundamental purposes and effects of refrain is, as I say, to break out of a narrative temporality into a lyric time whose primacy the refrain asserts. So in this little Goethe poem, we have the temporal structure. The poem itself is actually quite complex. We have an anecdote in the past that recounts a threat and a prediction which projects a future, that you will always think of me, a future which will be a repetition of the past. And the poem, which returns chantingly in each stanza to the rose, shows the sort of thing that this would involve, that the reader who's invited to, in a sense, to repeat the refrain, finds him or herself occupying the place of the Knabe, the youth who addressed the rose in the first place. And of course, the poem produces the predicted result that we're always thinking of the rose in every stanza. We don't get away from that. We don't get away from that rose. So this is a poem that offers many characteristics of lyric. It's got complexity of structures of address, a ritualistic aspect, effects of presence, of making this rose present to us as the rose is addressed, and a certain kind of performativity in which the poem seems to accomplish what it predicts by making us always think of the rose, etc. And of course, it also posits through the structures of address, an interpersonal relation between man and nature, which in this case, of course, interpretation will, especially in these precincts, will render sexual, but whose nature and a structure in which nature is invested with agency, affect, and signification in ways that are really quite extravagant, and with the extravagance that's quite characteristic of lyric, though it's not easy to detect that here, perhaps because the poem is so modest and subtle and modest in appearance. But anyway, I want to stress above all the way the lyric elements, by transformation of narrative, lift us out of an anecdotal space into this distinctively lyric or poetic one. Just like that.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Marilyn Nelson has heroically attended the Maine Writers Conference, AWP, and also agreed to be on this panel, so we're grateful that she was able to get here. Formerly Poet Laureate of the state of Connecticut, Marilyn Nelson is the author or translator of 12 books and 3 chapbooks, including award-winning books for younger readers. Winnowing a few from her many honors, she has garnered 2 NEA Creative Writing Fellowships, the 1990 Connecticut Arts Award, an ACLS Contemplative Practices Fellowship, a Fulbright Teaching Fellowship, 3 honorary doctorates, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. 3 of her books have been finalists for the National Book Award, and many of them have been celebrated through other honors as well. The Fields of Praise, New and Selected Poems, for example, also won the 1998 Poets Prize and was a finalist for the Penn Winship Award and the Lenore Marshall Prize. One of many reasons we were delighted she accepted the invitation to be on this panel is that her poems are often narratives in all the senses of the word, narratives that help us think about the political, ethical, and emotional impact of telling and listening to stories, especially their fraught relationship to memory. Nelson's tales seem unassuming in their everyday diction and details, which reminds me of another knock-on-wood memory, One Begins. Yet from and through that apparent rendering of the ordinary, soar up and swing out lines that powerfully but subtly raise the largest questions. Quote, "Thank you for dust." But Marilyn Nelson writes for the ear as well as for the conscience and the mind and the heart. So when she reads, let's listen as well to all her subtle uses of rhyme and complex stanza forms.
Thank you. As you know, I've been sweating this panel because the last time I thought seriously about narrative was in graduate school 40 years ago, when I took a seminar on theory of the novel, and I was part of the seminar group was required to write a short story using some of the theories we had been studying, And I was so overwhelmed by this that I was unable to write anything at all. And it was the first and worst experience of writer's block. I thought I would read a narrative first and then see whether I could extract 2 minutes worth of commentary about it. This is a section of a very long poem called The Cachoeira Tales, excuse me, which is a kind of riff on Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. It starts with the idea of an extended pilgrimage in Bahia, in Brazil, undertaken by a group of African-American tourists who are identified by occupation instead of name, and who, although early in the prologue, the poet in the group suggests that they have a little competition to see who tells the best story, but everyone else poo-poos this. So instead of telling stories, they just tell anecdotes and jokes. And this section is toward the middle of the pilgrimage. Let's see, what else do I have to tell you about it? The group has encountered a couple of sort of down-home African-American tourists who are out to get their groove on. They appear as kind of clowns in this. Their names are Harmonia and Maureen. And my son appears in this. He was studying a semester abroad. His name is Jake. And so this begins with the introduction of Jake's suggestion, excuse me, of our going someplace in Salvador de Bahia. We were going to hear a famous group of drummers called Olodum. So this is called Olodum. Has a little epigraph: where there is dancing, there is hope. Jake had to take some books back up to Cria, where teens study Brazilian poesia and read bits of translated poetry. The apple didn't fall far from the tree. And Olodum was playing later that night. We shouldn't miss them. They were dynamite, he said. So in the middle afternoon, we rode to Pelourinho. Olodum, a band of drummers, was an important part of that section's renewal, using art as a hammer to reshape poverty into a thriving tourist industry. We walked again along the treeless streets, past vendors of souvenirs, ribbons, gum, sweets, and fragrant acarajé. Musicians played, youths performed capoeira. Our parade of tourist dollars was welcomed again by vendors who remembered us as friends. My friends, they called in English. I love you. We spent more money. What else can you do? We sought refuge in the St. Francis Church, whose gilt interior invited us to search for gargoyle cherubs angry slaves had carved for lazy fat cat Christians while they starved. Some are still grimacing, but the hard-ons the guidebooks mentioned all seem to be gone. The activists suggested daintily that a restroom was needed urgently. We hastened out to search for a cafe. The director told a story on the way. This friend of mine told me she had to pee immediately once while she was skiing down a Colorado mountainside. She had to go so badly, she decided to pull over in a clump of pines and do her thing. She skied to the tree line, hid, lowered her pants, and squatted. As she sighed two relieved clouds of steam, she started to slide backwards out of the trees. She couldn't stop. She skied up a large mogul. In the drop-off coming down the other side, she fell and sprained her knee. The vigilant ski patrol travoyed her to a waiting ambulance. Supine, she struggled to pull up her pants, wondering why they were just idling there. Sometime later, the ski patrol reappeared with a young man who had broken his arm. After they'd gotten him settled and warm, as they sirened down the curvaceous mountain road, she asked him how he'd fallen. He replied that a bare-assed woman skiing backwards had sped toward him. In order to avoid colliding with this sight beyond belief, he'd swerved without looking and hit a tree. We took turns. Then we took turns ordering our dinners. Wine, of course, and rice and beans, Brazil's famous feijoada. As we raised our glasses to the pilot's nightly praise, well, the trip has been great so far. We heard a familiar commotion, and the birds of paradise were borrowing 2 chairs from other tables to pull up to ours. "You all certainly do not know how to throw a party," said Harmonia. Closing her eyes, raising her hands, for once Maureen seemed speechless momentarily. We ate, they ordered, waited, said grace over their plates, and joined the general gusto. "Lord, these beans are better than my mama's," said Maureen. "I eat them every chance I get. Too bad old ass can't whistle." After we'd ha-ha'd, she added, "Of course y'all know why it can't." "How can y'all be black and so ignorant?" I thought, good question. "Well," she said, "I'll tell you since you ask. It was during a spell of bad hunting. Trickster shot a gazelle at the end of another hungry day. He made a fire, spitted the meat, and lay with his back to the fire to take a nap. He told his ass to stay awake, keep watch, and whistle a warning if it saw a thief. Then Trickster closed his eyes and fell asleep. A jackal skulked out of a nearby bush. The ass whistled. It fled. Trickster said, "Hush, ain't nothing there," and he went back to sleep. 2 jackals came. The ass whistled, "Peep, peep." They fled. Trickster woke up, said, "I told you, hush." Ain't nothing there. His breath became the shush of sleep again. 3 jackals. The ass peeped. Trickster awoke, furious, out of a deep sleep, and looked around. "You double expletive liar," he yelled, "take this." And he sat down in the fire to punish ass for crying wolf. Poor ass got badly burnt. That's how it come to pass that ass can't whistle when it tries. Maureen puckered her lips. We roared like libertines. The enclosed plaza where Olodum plays was crammed with colors, from Café au lait to Hirsch's Kisses, trademark, and Pig's Feet, a crowd that overflowed into the street and down the block. The only tickets left were sold by scalpers guilty of horse theft with their outrageous prices, but we paid to be shoehorned in and gallimaufried. Joined skin to skin, we moved like molecules in the great impossible miracle of atmosphere, swaying to the music, all eyes on the stage, all hearts attuning themselves in beautiful polyrhythmy, one shaking booty. On one side of me, a young man danced, and I felt his muscled warmth flow into mine, his pure sexual strength. On the other sides, young women danced, whose curves bumped me softly, dancing without reserve, hands waving in the air, releasing scent fragrant as nard. We danced in reverent, silent assent to the praise song of drums. The singers sang in Portuguese, but one repeated English phrase I understood: if Jesus were a black man. In the crowd, one molecule remembered a long, loud 60s party where several of her friends from different African countries took turns playing a Quaker's oatmeal box, surprised that the rhythms meant the same things to their tribes. The drums talk. Is there no Rosetta Stone by which to translate their names for the one whose dark faces mask divine radiance? I thought I understood then. They said yes. God doesn't prefer one language, one gesture, one form of prayer, one praying posture. God doesn't prefer the ascetic's self-denial to the delighted joy dance of the child. Half the families in Brazil earn less than $4,000 a year. There are estimates that 8 to 10 million children live in the street. Yes, say the drums. Yes, say the hips and feet, dancing to sacred music. Levity celebrates life's one drumbeat brevity. The problems I was struggling with here, part of it had to do with my desire to emulate Chaucer and to keep this structure of couplets, of rhyme couplets going, and to keep a kind of bouncy, the iambic pentameter, the rhythm is very bouncy all through this poem. It's not regular. But that was the main problem that was occupying my mind as I was working on it. But I also was occupied with the question of how to move from one time to another. There are flashbacks. There's a mythical time, and then there is a remembered time, and then there is the time there in the church and in the cafe and at the concert. So I was struggling with all of these issues, although I must honestly confess that I wasn't thinking about these issues theoretically. They were just nose to the ground. How do I get from here to here? How do I get from there to there without falling on my face? So I think I've spoken much too long, so I'll
But we all
stop.
enjoyed it. Thank you very
Thank you.
much. One of many signs of Willie Perdomo's engagement with the issue of narrative is that he often writes about that parallel to and embodiment of narrative, travel and movement. Thus, for example, his work includes a lyric about the Metro-North train system, as well as a lovely book for sale outside that he composed for children about a trip to Langston Hughes' house. But these poems themselves are so often staccato in their rhythms, dashing and gliding and jerking between their brief stops with the rapidity and energy of a New York subway train. They travel among languages, registers, and codes as well, between prose and poetry, between Spanish and English, between vulgar language and numerous literary allusions. The author of 2 collections of poetry, 2 children's books, that's a preoccupation he shares with Marilyn Nelson, and editor of an anthology of poems about New York, Willie Perdomo has also been involved in video, television, and theater productions. This work has been recognized through many awards. For example, he's been a Pushcart Prize nominee, a Woolrich Fellow in Creative Writing at Columbia, and a 2009 Fellow in Poetry from the New York Foundation of the Arts. He's also sponsored the careers of other writers as a founder of Cipher Books and is one of the guiding lights in the movement of Latino writers, Accentos, a Bronx-based organization that fosters the work of such writers in New York and beyond. This commitment to other writers, incidentally, is another thing he shares with Marilyn Nelson, who is the founder of a very highly respected, and I understand quite wonderful, writers' colony. Willie Perdomo's books, like those of Marilyn Nelson and myself, will be on sale after the reading, and those of the literary critics as well. And it's a particular pleasure for me to introduce him because he's read in the series I curate to a tremendous fan club, and because we're delighted that he's teaching for us this semester at Fordham.
Thank you. She does not know her beauty. She thinks her brown body has no glory. If she could dance naked under palm trees and see her image in the river, she would know. But there are no palm trees on the street, and dishwater gives back no images. This is a poem written by a man named Warren Cuny. I think it was published in 1916. He was not necessarily a key figure in the Harlem Renaissance, but this was an iconic poem during the Harlem Renaissance when it was first published in The Opportunity. Unfortunately, I didn't have and give out any copies because I don't think you really need copies of this poem, especially during the breakdown. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about, and Warren Cuny was trained in the music conservatory, so his ear was well tuned, I think, to a lyric, and it's not a coincidence that most of his work has been interpreted musically, most notably by Nina Simone. I propose this poem as sort of an anti-lyric, in a sense, a fractured lyric, a line that it's broken into short, compact lines whose key components are on display. It's 3 stanzas tall, 13 lines long, and each stanza is a self-contained narrative unit. I don't think, in my estimation, Cuny, he doesn't get lost or even weighed down by maybe a list of attributes per se, and he cuts straight to the vital parts. She does not know her beauty. She thinks her brown body has no glory. Not shape, no figure, curve, nor plentitude, but glory. Cuny establishes a premise. He initiates a rhetorical structure at this point, dealing with the poet's realm of beauty and glory. The lines are almost like dances unto themselves. If she could dance naked under palm trees and see her image in the river, she would know. Once again, the rhetorical structure at this point is kind of further engaged. He's using the first half of the if-then construction, which utilizes a cause and effect. Is there a certain amount of objectification? Sure. I would concede to that. But why naked? Well, it's the essence of truth sometimes, I think. The word, which might have been lost, I think, in a traditional lyric poem, stands out as its own line in this poem. As poets, we count on the image for reflection, for self-knowledge, and even for uncomfortable exposure. And sometimes what we find is that the images can't hold the weight of the emotion. He ends it by saying, but there are no palm trees on the street, and dishwater gives back no images. This passage of going from unknowing to knowing, it's a confrontation with reality at that point. The dream behind the proposed joy has experienced a sort of a reformation, not a reformation, but a creative deformation, I think, at this point. And I like to say that Cuny performed a sort of acupuncture on the lyric by this point. He breaks it apart into different kinds of lyrical schemes, and they still hold the demands of narrative. One of the things that I sort of close out and maybe propose as a point of conversation at some point, what happens when the lyric is too broken? I read an interview with the novelist Louise Erdrich, and one of the things that she found interesting about when she started writing prose, and one of the reasons she started writing prose was because she said narrative was invading her poetry. So what is some of the symptoms at this point of this invasion? What happens when a poet loses control of his or her line? And is it possible that a poet can find a lyric or a narrative in that least of all poetic elements, the sentence? So, thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
James Phelan is Distinguished University Professor of English at The Ohio State University. A leader in the field of narratology, he's a founding member of Ohio State's Project Narrative, the editor of the journal Narrative, and co-editor of the Ohio State University Press series on the theory and interpretation of narrative. But that bold list can't convey the energy and intelligence he brings to his work as editor. I myself benefited greatly from that when he not only suggested just the right title for me, but also made some wonderful additions and suggestions about an essay. In any event, as that list of his contributions to narratology suggests, he comes to our topic today from the perspective of a rhetorical narrative theorist. That is, he's interested in accounting for the various ways authors and readers interact through the deployment and negotiation of textual forms. Phelan has developed this perspective in a series of books that collectively outline a comprehensive rhetorical theory of narrative. Worlds from Words, Reading People, Reading Plots, Narrative as Rhetoric, Living to Tell About It, and Experience Fiction. And if you haven't gotten the point already, some of those are on sale outside too. Each of the last three books develops revisionist ideas about the different kinds of author-reader interaction that characterize narrative on the one hand and lyric on the other. For example, in arguing cogently that narrative impels and lyric blocks judgment on characters, he challenges the commonplace association of lyric poetry and stasis. Jim?
Thank you, Heather. My handout has two poems by Robert Frost. In the interest of time, I'm going to read Out and not read Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. I'm assuming that, sort of nobody gets out of high school without having encountered Stopping by Woods. So I'll start with Out. The buzzsaw snarled and rattled in the yard, sweet-scented stuff when the breeze drew across it. And from there, those that lifted eyes could count 5 mountain ranges, one behind the other, under the sunset far into Vermont. And the saw snarled and rattled as it ran light or had to bear a load. And nothing happened. Day was all but done. Call it a day, I wish they might have said, to please the boy by giving him the half hour that a boy counts so much when saved from work. His sister stood beside them in her apron to tell them, supper. At the word, the saw, as if to prove saws knew what supper meant, leaped out at the boy's hand, or seemed to leap. He must have given the hand. However it was, neither refused the meeting. But the hand! The boy's first outcry was a rueful laugh, as he swung toward them holding up the hand, half in appeal, but half as if to keep the life from spilling. Then the boy saw all, since he was old enough to know. Big boy doing a man's work, though a child at heart, he saw all spoiled. Don't let him cut my hand off. The doctor, when he comes. Don't let him, sister. So, but the hand was gone already. The doctor put him in the dark of ether. He lay and puffed his lips out with his breath. And then the watcher at his pulse took fright. No one believed. They listened at his heart. Little, less, nothing. And that ended it. No more to build on there. And they, since they were not the one dead, turned to their affairs. I choose these two Frost poems because I like them, because I think they exemplify some very different ways of intertwining narrative and poetry, or more precisely, narrative and lyric. My claim is that although both poems tell stories, Stopping by Woods uses its narrative in the service of lyric ends, while Out Out uses its lyric qualities in the service of narrative ends. But I'll back up and try to explain how I define narrative and lyric. And this definition stems from my conception of literary works as rhetorical actions that have designs on their audiences. And that in turn means I'm interested in what I call textual dynamics and readerly dynamics and their interactions. By textual dynamics, I mean the principles governing the movement of a text from its beginning through its middle to its end. And by readerly dynamics, I mean the trajectory of the audience's responses to these textual dynamics. Further, the textual dynamics for narrative correspond to that mode's interest in tracing change over time, and thus the textual dynamics of narrative follow a sequence of instability, complication of instability, resolution, or partial resolution. The readerly dynamics for narrative, I suggest, depends on the audience's activities of observing and judging characters as those characters' experience change over time. Okay, so that's key. So textual, we have instability, complication, resolution. The audience is observing and judging. In lyric, it seems to me the textual dynamics correspond to its interest in exploring situations, thoughts, emotions, attitudes, and so on. And as Heather suggested, it seems to me the lyric is kind of indifferent to the question of change. Okay, sometimes we'll see change, sometimes we won't. But the dynamics really are about the processes of unfolding, developing, or revealing. Okay? And the readerly dynamics of lyric, I suggest, depend on the audience's entering into this perspective of the lyric speaker, and thus the audience wants to try on the thoughts, emotions, attitudes, or experiences of the lyric speaker. So it seems to me that the textual dynamics of both Out Out and Stopping by Woods are those of narrative. In each case, we can see Frost introduces an instability. In Out Out, it's the buzzing, rattling saw. In Stopping by Woods, it's the speaker's attraction to those woods. And then Frost complicates that instability. The saw reacts to the word supper, and the boy's hand gets cut. The speaker in Stopping by Woods contemplates going to lie down. Finally, in each case, Frost resolves the complication. The boy dies, and the others go back to work. The speaker in Stopping by Woods decides he's got promises to keep and miles to go before he sleeps. But it seems to me the poems have very different readerly dynamics. In Out Out, the audience is asked to observe and judge and feel shock at both the boy's death and at the callousness of the witnesses turning to their own affairs. Indeed, it seems to me that Frost signals the lyric dimension of the poem not in its textual dynamics, but rather in its title, with its echo of Macbeth's tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow soliloquy, itself a great lyric interruption of a story of change over time. So, Out Out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. The title leads us to link the narrative of Frost's poem to this lyric attitude toward life, and reflecting on the title may complicate our judgments of the witnesses. Maybe there's more to it than callousness. But the poem as a whole seems to me to function as a theme-driven narrative. In Stopping by Woods, on the other hand, the readerly dynamics are those of lyric. Encouraged by the present tense and the use of the I as a central consciousness, rather than as an out-out, an observer-narrator, the audience is encouraged to enter into the speaker's situation. Thus, as the textual dynamics follow the sequence of instability, complication, resolution, we focus on the sequence of the speaker's feelings. His attraction to the woods, his greater attraction, his turn back to the obligations of life. Furthermore, I would suggest this lyric experience of participating in the speaker's feelings overrides the textual dynamics of narrative. And I'm going to try to prove this with this concluding thought experiment. Suppose we judge, as we very well might, the speaker of Stopping by Woods as a self-dramatizing egoist who needs to get over himself. Okay. Such a judgment seems to me is simultaneously a negative aesthetic judgment of the whole poem. not a judgment that Frost wants us to make. If, on the other hand, we judge the witnesses of the boy's death in Out Out as callous, right, we are not making a judgment for or against the poem, but a judgment integral to our understanding of the poem. The difference in these two kinds of judgments represents the difference between the readerly dynamics of lyric and of narrative, and helps explain why narrative is the dominant mode of Out Out and lyric the dominant mode of Stopping by Woods. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. Excuse me?
Would it be out of turn to make a comment?
Shall we all finish reading first?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. If that's okay. Yeah. Okay. Then, by all means, yes. Shakespeare's Sonnet 129, the poem on the smaller sheets of paper, famously evokes the demands, the delights, and the disgusts associated with erotic desire. The expense of spirit in a waste of shame is lust in action, and till action lust is perjured, murderous, bloody, full of blame, savage, extreme, rude, cruel, not to trust. Enjoyed no sooner, but despised straight. Past reason hunted, and no sooner had past reason hated as a swallowed bait, on purpose laid to make the taker mad. Mad in pursuit and in possession, so had, having and in quest to have, extreme, a bliss in proof, and proved a very woe. Before a joy proposed, behind a dream. All this the world well knows, yet none knows well, to shun the heaven that leads men to this hell. But what's a nice panelist like me doing in a poem like that? Okay, not only might my mother not approve, more to the point here, on the surface it might seem to be a textbook example of the meditative intensity that, as other panelists have suggested, is often associated with lyric, rather than an opportunity for thinking about narrative elements. And in fact, it includes many other characteristics that, as we've already seen, commonly, if problematically, define lyric. That single speaking voice, the intensity, the rendition of a state of mind, the brevity. Yet, in fact, the poem is also connected to narrative in many ways. If we look at just a few qualities often used to define that form, a list that, of course, has been expanded today, that's been questioned in many circles, we see that they include the representation of a series of events, what happens next, as Jonathan put it, a focus on causality, which Willie Perdomo spoke about so cogently, a movement towards a change or solution. When we play these and other characteristics against this sonnet, it can, in fact, help us to think about the relationship of narrative and lyric. And it does so, I suggest, in three ways. First, the poem invites us to think about the temporal change, often posited as absolutely central to narrative. On one level, this sonnet is all about the progression of events as sexual fulfillment is pursued, realized, questioned. Similarly, the critic Helen Vendler argues it pivots on two different temporalities, that is, the moment of experiencing and the moment of reevaluating desire. In any event, look at all the markers of time passing, words like till and before, behind, where behind means after, the movement between had, having, and in quest to have, one of the passages marked on your handout, flags temporal change. In fact, there, the irregular rhythm and the curious sequence of words to which I'll return, by their very unexpectedness, draw attention to the temporal movement among these states. But of course, such changes involve not a neatly linear movement, but cycles and circles, thus complicating temporality, and thus suggesting both the unique moment, sometimes associated with narrative, and a repeated act. We find, for example, had, having, and quest to have, rather than in quest to have, having, and had. These repetitious cycles clearly complicate the very idea of temporal progression. Notice, too, the intriguing relation to time in another phrase I've underlined, no sooner, which both introduces a classical temporal marker, sooner, and appends a negative that denies time, no sooner, thus suggesting the virtual coexistence of events. I don't think all this erases the narrative elements in the sonnet, especially given extended definitions of narrative by Jim Phelan and many others, but it certainly complicates them, much as the fractured narratives, which gets back to what we've been hearing about fractured lyrics, in texts ranging from the novel Tristram Shandy to films by director like Julie Taymor and Tarantino do. I trust, given that I've said this, I can now count all my movie tickets as tax deductible? Right, okay. The second and related way the poem is linked to narrative is that it does indeed involve stories. Lust is first hunted, then had, then hated, because it's a lure, a bait, a progression emphasized by the repetition of those H's. But of course, the whole point is that the end is often a new beginning. In this poem, the rejection of love as hated slides towards a more positive view of it as a dream. Thus, many of these tales involve what we've been hearing about, causality. All this suggests the third connection with narrative. In writing of desire, the poem is trying to write it as a narrative in one of the more traditional senses, something with clear stages, something whose fulfillment can also be a conclusion. But desire resists that form of narrative and instead becomes a story about failed attempts to achieve storytelling. So the sonnet that at first glance may seem to be a neat example of lyric is also meta-narrative, that is, narrative about narrative. In other words, the failure to resist or control lust is represented as failed attempts to tame desire into a conventional narrative. In short, then, the poem also introduces some issues we may want to pursue in more detail. Given the way this text complicates textbook definitions, given what my fellow panelists have said, how should we reconceive poetry and narrative? Issues addressed by both precept and example by all the members of the panel. In what ways do lyric and narrative interact? Thank you very much. To get started with our discussion, why don't I pose one question related to the ones we've all been asking, and then invite the panelists to talk and pose any others. How about that issue about definitions of lyric and narrative? When we see the sort of things that many of you have been talking about, narratives that can be described as fractured narratives, lyrics that break apart in some of the ways people are talking about, should we talk about anti-narrative, anti-lyric? Should we talk about some sort of amalgam of the two? What are the investments in our choice of words and definitions?
Well, one way to think about it is that definitions are less about text than about forms. Mm-hmm. And text will do different things with those forms. Right. So, I mean, in a longer version of what I would say, what I said here, I would talk not just about narrative and lyric, but about narrativity and lyricality as sort of impulses, and then some different forms. So, so for me, I would then tend to think about amalgamations or hybrids, lyric narratives, and so on. So, but I think Jonathan invoked Roman Jakobson, and he has this idea of the dominant, right? So I think it's also often worth thinking about what is the dominant mode in a particular text. So in the Goethe, it seems to me the dominant mode is lyric, as Jonathan was suggesting, but there's a significant narrative piece of it. And in my cases, there's narrative and lyric, and I was trying to say one is dominant in one and one is dominant in the other.
Yeah, one issue we really haven't talked about, which seems to me very important here, has to do. I mean, with narratives, we tend to think that a story has a narrator. There's going to be somebody telling the story, etc. A narrative voice. One reason I chose the poem I did was because it doesn't make much sense to think of that poem as being narrated by anyone. It doesn't advance our understanding, so it sort of clarifies the situation. We don't get the mess of a narrator. But in something like Stopping by Woods, there is a narrative voice, a first person speaking that. But as soon as you've got a narrative voice in a lyric or in a poem with rhymes, meter, and other poetic devices, the problem that immediately arises is what's the relationship between that narrator and those devices? Does the narrator think that he's producing rhymes? Does he know that he's speaking in iambic pentameter or tetrameter?
Yeah.
Usually we think not. Usually we say, in a dramatic monologue like My Last Duchess, the Duke says, even had I skill in speech as I have not, and we don't say, he's just being modest because he's really producing these beautiful couplets, etc. We say, no, he's some rough man of action who will just give orders to have his wife killed and not an eloquent poet. So we attribute, all those poetic devices are unlocated in some ways. They're attributed to the poet, shall we say, rather than to the narrator. So, I think one of the things that produces the sense of the dominance of lyric in Stopping by Woods is that the very prominence of those rhymes, the repetition of the final line, etc., and the stanzaic form, that seems more prominent than this sort of little mini narrative elements that we have there, and hence I think you're quite right in saying this is a narrative put to lyric ends, whereas out almost no rhymes, the meter is rough, etc. It's clearly a narrative.
May I ask how would you distinguish between the narrative voices of exactly those two Frost? The two Frost poems. One of them, there is a voice saying since they were not the ones. There is a voice, but it's not an embodied voice. It's an implied narrator. How would you distinguish between those two kinds of narrative voices? The Stopping by Woods, there is someone there. You can imagine him. But the voice of the other poem, very different.
Very different.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I would say the I in Out is a kind of device that Frost adopts
Do you mean the EYE?
to be this. Huh?
Do you mean the I?
The I,
capital
yes.
I or the I seer?
I wish they might have said, call it a day.
Okay.
Right, I wish they might have said. It's a device that he adopts in the service of sort of giving a kind of observer witness to the whole thing, but that I would distinguish that I from the poet who's constructing the whole thing, right, and deciding where the line breaks are and all that kind of thing. And so in that sense, I'd see a sort of more of a difference between the I of the poem and Frost as a poet. In Stopping by Woods, it seems to me not necessarily that Frost had this experience, but that he is occupying that I position just as the reader is asked to. And in that sense, this is a kind of dramatic lyric in which Wordsworth, I wandered lonely as a cloud, or sort of the I and the poet and the audience kind of come together, contemplating this experience. Whereas there's something about the otherness of the action in Out.
Let me also ask a question that further complicates what Marilyn and Jim and Jonathan have been saying. So far we're talking about individual lyrics, but of course lyrics are often pack animals. People have written sequences of lyric, as you have, for example, and a lot of these questions may vary from one poem to another in the sequence in ways that complicate. That is, you can think of a particular sonnet as straightforwardly lyric, but what happens when it's in a sequence that at least gestures towards narrative? What happens when you have different voices in different sonnets?
again, I think it depends on cases, and again, I think it's worth thinking about the poet in relationship to the speaker.
Yeah.
So the poet may be constructing the narrative out of individual lyrics, and the gaps between the lyrics become really important of the interaction between the poet and the audience. To sort of say, okay, well, if we put this lyric next to this lyric and we fill in the gap, we can construct a narrative. The agent who's directing that is not the speaker of either lyric, but rather the poet who's constructing the sequence.
And your point about the reader also, and the reader's expectations that sonnets could be part of a sequence. Comments from other panelists on this?
I don't know. I'm still trying to formulate my theory that somehow a good poem is like a good bank robbery, you know. And I always feel somehow that the lyric poem or the sequence of sonnets is a bank robbery that takes too long sometimes, you know. I mean, you know, and that's probably because of the poetry, you know, that I was introduced to when I started learning to write poems, and most of them were what Jonathan calls in his book, his literary theory, a very short introduction, a little poem based on Ezra Pound's at the Metro, at the station at the Mayor, And so for me to invoke Marilyn's line in the poem of art being a hammer, you know, CUNY's poem hit me more like a sledgehammer, you know. Because of its brevity, because of its speed, because of its concision. And I don't know if it's the lyric necessarily has to be engaged at that point, but it still will hold the demands of telling a story. A beginning, end, and middle, a beginning, middle, end, not sure, but creating a picture that tells the story and even challenging that picture in the same breath, which I found intriguing. And this is the kind of thing, these are the kind of stories that I used to hear. They weren't very long, but they packed extreme punch. And I think that's where, and they were also witty and lyrical too, you know, but at standing there hearing the stories, I didn't construe them as a lyric, in a sense, because I didn't hear people talking in those kind of rhythms, basically. The rhythms I was hearing were they were cracked rhythms, in a sense. They were punctured lyrics. They were lyrics that were injected with multilingualism, you know. So that gave way toward another construction at that point.
You know, your points, Willie, bring up a couple of things that the panelists might want to follow up. You talk about multilingualism. To what extent do we need to be more culturally specific when we're talking about lyric and narrative? That is, to what extent do narratives from certain traditions have a very different relationship between lyric and narrative? And also you mentioned how you reacted. So how much of this definition of genre is made by an audience, by a reader, to get to one of Jim's points?
Well, I wondered about, I don't know the poem you were referring to at the beginning, the CUNY poem. You said 6 stanzas?
So no, it's 3 stanzas.
3 stanzas.
Yeah.
Does it actually
13 lines long.
Does it have a narrative, or is it a sort of broken narrative?
I suppose it has somewhat of art. I think it has more of a rhetorical construction than anything else, but yeah.
It sounded from your characterization of it as though it might be fragmentary, and the reader then puts this together and imagines a sort of a backstory and imagines a story.
Yeah, you can definitely bring a backstory to it. I mean, this is that dream deferred narrative all over again, but told differently, you know. So.
Heather, does it make any sense to, I mean, we are here at the Philoctetes Center and we sort of deal with psychological matters. I don't know if this is helpful at all, but I was sort of inspired by I can't stop thinking about the vignette in the middle of the poem where the woman takes a piss and then the guy breaks his arm, you know. And so patients, you know, when they go into therapy like myself, you know, they tell narratives. And the narrative is like what O'Neill talked about in The Iceman Cometh. It's their life lie.
Yeah,
it's their thing. Now, this is not to discountenance, artifice, conceit, the whole world of poetry. And now I'm bringing in reality. But you've brought in reality. You've, to some extent, brought in reality. And the question of multilingualism and kind of the distillation of poetry, the relationship between narrative and reality, I guess I'm sort of talking about. And then you mentioned Jacobson, you know, and Saussure. And you know, therapists at an earlier time were very interested in that in terms of parsing out patient narratives, semiotics and signs and so forth and so on. I don't don't know if this is just a non sequitur.
Could I say that not only does it make sense, it raises broad questions about the functions narrative serves in a whole range of different communities. I'm aware that not only psychotherapists, but internists, other specialists, other types of doctors are thinking more and more about the narrative that the patient tells, building a narrative. There's a doctor named Michael Hutchin, for example, who's written a lot on this.
There's a program at Columbia on narrative.
Yes.
On narrative.
Yes, right.
You get a degree in it.
Right. Rita Sharon's program, right?
Yes, Sharon's program. Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm aware that one term that keeps on coming up is fractured, breaking apart, and that introduces the range of different vocabularies our panelists used, if I can find the sheet on which I scribbled them all down, in talking about the relationship between narrative and lyric. We heard about competing, overriding, lifting, anti-narrative, invading. And obviously this differs from one poem to another, but we might think further about how those work, to what extent one should also build a model of cooperation. I always worry that the Academy maybe now leans a little bit towards models of competition and tension and talking about how forms work. So where do we go with that? Do we just say it varies poem by poem, or do we try to work out some sort of model?
Well, clearly narrative and lyric impulses can go together in a poem. I think part of the competition comes at the level of explanation, accounting, description, and certainly one of the things that I've wanted to resist is what I see as a general narrativization of lyric, shall we say. It's partly because most students study narratives, then when they are confronted with a poem, in order to make it more acceptable, you say, well, think of this as a little story. What's the situation? There's a speaker. What's happened already? Helen Bendler asks them gives it a little checklist. One of the points is, what are the antecedents? And then what is the speaker doing? And you try to transform the poem into a little narrative. And many poems can successfully be transformed into mini narratives, but a lot of them are much more, and partly because of the artifice of lyric, and because lyric is so often fantastical, with speaking to roses who talk back, etc. You can make it into a story, but if it's a story, it's a fantastical story, and it's better to insist on all those things that make it different from a short story.
I think too, the other issue is the extent to which culturally one form might seem to be superseding the other. And so, I mean, one of the things I talk about often as I see as editor of narrative is the kind of narrative imperialism, sort of this claim for, I think it's part of what Jonathan's talking about too, and we see it with our students, that, let's claim more and more territory for narrative, right? So I could imagine a poet in particular saying, all right, enough. Let me write anti-narrative and compete in that sense. I don't have a particularly good example, maybe John Ashbery or somebody, but you can imagine that kind of response, and that's definitely competitive, but to sort of make this kind of cultural point.
For airtime.
I like this Ashbery.
Speaking of airtime, I want to make sure we have time for the poets to read and for all of you to participate. So why don't I say, what else would people like to bring up in the next few minutes before we move to the next segment?
If we're going to have poets reading and audience speaking, we should hear the poets now.
Okay. Anything else? Okay.
Or hear the audience. I don't know what.
Yes. Okay. We agreed
we have
that...
a hand over here, Heather.
Oh, okay.
I didn't know whether you were inviting questions or not.
Well,
do we want to, or it's up to you?
We definitely want questions. Do we want them now or after?
I think afterwards.
Okay, why don't we have the poets read, then I'll call on you right away. Okay, great. We asked if each poet would read for no more than 5 minutes. And this time we'll go in alphabetical order, so I will go first. Okay. I'm always interested in how dream is both narrative and lyric in some ways. So I want to start with a poem about a dream, about my mother's death, in fact. It's part of a series, speaking of narrative and lyric, a series of poems about her death. Waking hours. Last night I dreamed the undertakers had left you, smaller and perfectly preserved, wrapped and rolled in a closet among the furled umbrellas and the electric broom wonder you'd planned to repair before that first operation on the inoperable. You were as light to lift as hope. And I laid you on the bed, making sure your tiny head was safely on the pillow you plumped each morning as you grew thinner. Let me care for you again. Unfurl your smile again, mother, and protect my head from the cloudbursts of flashback. Then let me bury you again. The next poem I'll read is partly in tribute to this organization, since it was founded by psychiatrists, and of course psychiatry and neurology are very closely related. This one is about, or became out of, my experience with migraines and the aura, which is a very peculiar conflation of sound. See some people nodding, other migraine sufferers. Conflation of sound and sight that you can get. It started there, and then, like auras themselves, moved in a lot of different directions. Gray matter. These dreams are the curls of lyric, pigeons that sing Christmas carols, apricots who go ice skating, the roundness of bedtime stories, every green as frank as grass, no fruits moldy, no laugh bruised. These dreams are the foam of morning. Auras are the brain gone naughty, lecture halls that smell of ether, light, a symptom to report, coffee grounds or turpentine, doorbells hum, familiar hymns, pathology, not grace, writes visions, auras, orchestra without conductor. Memory is a noisy house guest, garage sales run by grinning demons, rotting peach greens high school yearbooks, suitcases unpacked in stairwells, body piercing, birthday present for its bound and breathless victims. No one leaves without a prize. Memory is a naked twin. Fear is a determined mugger. Words are rooms that spin to nausea. Wind chimes with propeller blades. Gifts of rags already lit, smelling strong of turpentine. Birthday parties turn to alleys. Ashes, ashes will all burn down. Fears, the windmill of my mind. The last poem I want to read, I think we've heard some pretty heavy ones, is lighter. Is there anybody here who's as much of a fan as I am of the Asian galleries at the Metropolitan Museum? Yeah, aren't they terrific? And some of you may also know there's a museum in Geneva which focuses on Asian art called the Bauer Collections, which literally was, as this poem suggested, founded by somebody who made a fortune, and this gets back to Marilyn's poem indirectly, by selling manure. Okay? Okay. The Bauer Collection, admission, 5 francs. This is in a very complicated verse form known as sapphics, where you have to end on words that would normally end lines, have unusual stress systems. And it's a form that drives you absolutely bananas when you try to write on it. The Bauer Collection. Life, when it tries hard to imitate art, takes its cue from the sense of humor teenagers display. Thus witness Alfred Bauer, whose fortune for manure fertilized art. Porcelain treasures. Rose, a famille in which colors never quarrel. Pink buds, perching like butterflies on creamy curves, and its peaches feeling furry, but also there, she knows stoneware, sensibly graying. Lacquer preens here in the dimness, shining subtly. Rivers like a lover's skin in moonlight, silver and as speckled. Pines with golden needles. And there, water cascades, hair of a goddess. Jade and nephrite in this corner, lacing polyphony into patterns. Tendrils shaped like baskets, here sing chords of grapes. There, pale jade blossoms into a lotus, humming vines over blossoms. Swiss-born, Bauer lived for some years in Asia, founding A. Bauer, the Ceylon Manure Works. Eden was once there in Asia. He replanted it with all its gardens intact here in Geneva. Thank you. I feel honored to be reading with the poets I am. Moving alphabetically again, let's turn to Marilyn Nelson.
Oh, it's me?
Okay. And let me reassure the audience that we're all reading briefly, and there will be time for your questions in a few minutes.
I feel I've already read too long.
How about choosing a short one? Because I'm sure
I will.
everybody would love to hear you again.
This is a poem in the voice of George Washington Carver. It's toward the end of his life. It's a very small poem. It's called The Dimensions of the Milky Way. The dimensions of the Milky Way were discovered or described by Harlow Shapley in 1918. Behind the men's dorm, at dusk on a late May evening, Carver lowers the paper and watches the light change. He tries to see Earth across a distance of 25,000 light years from the center of the Milky Way. A grain of pollen, a spore of galactic dust. He looks around. That shagbark, those swallows, the fireflies, that blasted mosquito, this beautiful world. 100 billion stars in a roughly spherical, flattened disk with a radius of 100 light years. Imagine that. He catches a falling star. Well, Lord, this infinitesimal speck could fill the universe with praise.
Thank you, Marilyn.
Thank you.
I'll read what I noticed about the poems that I'm going to read. All of them are having, a conversation with the culture of poetry. And this is called Open Mic Rim Shot. There's something in the air. Sounds like Miss Mary is trying to sum it all up, getting all into the hum of stormy Monday, and today was just as bad. Switch to the stage, short-circuited tombstone solos, cosmopolitan smirks. You know the world is changing when you're on your first coffee break and a complete stranger asks you to tell him something uplifting. Amor con amor se paga. Candlelight poets, bass singers. Who is that coppin', please, talking about they haven't played that tune in a while? The day is thunderstruck and heavy-footed. Branches are dumb and forget far. The apples have stopped falling. Difference between poets and jazz musicians is that you can't step to the bandstand and say, hey, do you know No Images? Standard stare after the last call, skylines consumed by torture, and a 1, and a 2, and a 3. This is called Planet Doom Poetry Drill. Planet Doom drill if you're first or you feature, usually the end is quiet. Swimmer ears can't hear the snowflakes, the breaks are beautifully perfect and the sun is ready. Talking all that gas, the diplomatic rule states that you go into a small upstate town and blow it up, brick city, a beat down for the ages. Dios no se queda con nada de nadie. Rake in those vegetable dollars, slick cats take your kickbacks, roll through the desert. It takes a tank to get a tank. Do the okey-doke windmill shuffle like the night Venus gassed Mars up into a jazz lust. Gots to be careful when the final call comes. Only plate left on the menu might be chuleta cancang. So jack the cooker fields, put on your gallon hats, skip the afternoon prayer, slip, slide, pull in the shake, and residue if you can. Automatic rifles come equipped with a clip full of prayers. Dios da y quita. Remember, what you do is tell the world that it's about to die, go in there, bum rush, chop off the head, and boom, take over the gush, then bag it up. Poetry? You speak poetry? Forget poetry. And this is based on one of my mentors created a forum called a bop. His name is Afa Michael Weaver, and I tried to write one. It's called Satin Ladies a Bop. And it is movement in the poem, and then there's a refrain of a lyric. It's like that with the muses, afternoon soliloquies, sex on the run, backdoor escapes after disastrous denouements. When the check comes, you can't pay. Put it this way, most damage is done walking out of the door. It's just the thought of you, the very thought of you, my love. With the other one, sun goddess, Buddhist chants for breakfast, started with macro, ended with micro, and left the flight plans in the sky. 2 couplets later, candle lit, she looked better leaving than when she came. No encore, no applause. It's just the thought of you, the very thought of you, my love. To stay and crush, to whisper or break out, to summon the rain into its proper dialectic, time to make a decision, away from the drizzle, far away from the image, and right toward the dance. It's just the thought of you, the very thought of you, my love.
The thought of all of you. We'd like to hear your comments. If anybody would either speak up loudly or go up to the mic. Would the mic be better, do you think, Francis?
Yeah, the mic is where they have to come because we are broadcasting.
Okay, let me erase that. Would anybody who wants to speak go up to the mic?
And you should tell us who you are because we're just curious.
Yes, you were going to. Thank you.
Sorry to break this poetic mood with a rather mundane question. My name is Stephanie Kiseluk, and I'm a professor at NYU. There is a third term that I have heard, I think, the panelists say, which I've been very intrigued by. And I'm not sure where one should position it in relation to narrative and lyric, but that term is story. And I wondered how we could possibly begin to define, or whether we even should try to define, what a story is. Obviously, not all stories are narratives, not all narratives are stories, and the same with lyric. So what are we doing with this third term, story? What exactly... I mean, I know we can say it has a beginning, middle, and end, but where does the beginning end and the middle begin? And how do we know it's the end? So I'm struggling with this term, which, bless you.
There's the story.
Story, and what it, how we can define it, or if we can define it.
Well, everybody's looking at me. Well, I think the definition of narrative itself is contested among people who do narrative theory, and it has to do in part with story. For me, I don't make a big distinction. It seems to me these are relatively synonymous terms.
But there are narratives that are not stories.
For example?
your checking account.
That's a list. If you give an account of the expenditures, then you're telling a story or constructing a narrative out of the list in the checking account.
So you believe every narrative is a story?
I do, but the others would disagree. Or what I think the other two terms here that are really important are event and character. And there's a strong sort of wing, or one of the divisions is really how much is event or eventfulness essential to narrative and story, and how much is some sense of experientiality, which could be independent of event and closer to the activation of consciousness. This is sort of Monica Fludenick's version of it. But I would also suggest that character is a place to think about a third option between narrative and lyric in terms of portraiture, so that the dramatic monologue, which Jonathan mentioned, seems to me to be different in that what it's about is the revelation of character. So My Last Duchess, for example, that's My Last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if it were alive. Right? Browning's project in that is to make the Duke stand there as if he were alive. And he does that through having the Duke tell a story about what happened to the previous Duchess. But if you want to, it seems to me that the point of the poem is really to get us to sort of contemplate the portrait of this Duke who has the temerity to tell this story to this person on this occasion. But the narrative there seems to me to be in service. Just one last point. It seems to me that then we can make a distinction between that kind of a dramatic monologue and something like Ulysses or Tithonus, the Tennyson poems, where it seems to me what you have is the poet using a speaker to sort of express ideas, or more sort of lyric, a mask lyric, as opposed to the dramatic monologue. And the difference really has to do with the relation between the poet and the speaker, and the relation between the narrative and the portrayal of character.
So story lies somewhere in the combination of character and narrative.
Well, story, again, I would think of story as somebody telling somebody else that something happened. Okay, and then then how does a particular author use story either in the service of narrative ends or lyric ends or portraiture ends?
I guess if I could have another chance to...
Come on up if you're going to talk. And then we're sort of...
I should also say that, this is me, and this is not all of narrative theory. People would quarrel with things I'm saying.
I need another chance to tell you what, a narrative that's not a story. I mean, there's tons of narratives that are not stories. Prayers, the Communist Manifesto. I mean, I think it has something else in addition to the author's stance towards his own character or the reader or whatever. There's just something there that's elusive.
Okay. Do you have a working definition? I mean, I think the terms aren't, I don't want to get stuck on terms. It's just really a question of the concepts behind the terms.
Exactly. How can we begin to formulate the concept behind it?
I'm glad you brought up those important points. Maybe somebody else from the audience has ideas on them or wants to raise another question. Okay, why don't you go up?
Introduce yourself. Formalize this whole experience.
We've got a gentleman behind you standing up who wants to get up too.
Yes, after, right. Thank you.
My name is Sarah Sarai, and I'm a poet. And I guess in terms of a term, it seems to me that in Marilyn's poem, she talked about the phrase, the great impossible miracle of atmosphere, which hit me. And it seems to me that that is more speaks to what I'm looking for in a poem. And it also, instead of just this is story, this is narrative, that it kind of engages. There's the dialogue there between the reader and the poet. And so I would prefer something like that, the great impossible miracle of atmosphere. Just to then we can decide what impossible miracle has been created by a poem. And if none has been created by a poem, the poem, so be it.
Okay, thank you. The man in the corner also wants
Come on
to.
up. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm Jeremy Mack. I'm a psychiatrist here in the city. I hoped that we were going to be talking about the impact of form on meaning, and the discussion having to do with the distinction between lyrical and narrative. I think, to me, doesn't so much describe difference in form. I think we all know that the Parthenon looks straight because it's curved. That there has to be an interaction between various forms of perception, various emotional states. You cannot tell a story with verisimilitude unless you edit it somewhat. On the other hand, I'm very struck with the sonnet and various forms of poetry. The sonnet, it seems to me, imposes a dramatic meaning that I think you don't see in other forms of poetry. And it seems to me it's different in terms of what it talks about. The Shakespeare that we read has to do with an analysis of a state of mind, shifting aspects of the state of mind, and at the end comes up with a dramatic turn. Chapman's Homer is the same thing. So I wonder if there would be some response to the question of the impact of form on the meaning.
Well, in the Goethe poem that I gave you, for example, it's clearly very important that especially in the German, that these words, so many of the key words go together. Brechen, stechen, or sprach, brach, stach, and then ach, of course. Those produces a solidity. Those actions, which in English may seem sort of random, form a unity in the German, partly because they all rhyme. That it's how can you not have how can this not be broken, and how can this how can the rose not stick the boy back, because those words go together. So I think certainly that's one of the main effects of poetic form. Or we could look at Stopping by Woods, where we have so much repetition. What's the effect of repeating that last line again? It's not just saying the same thing twice. It suddenly takes us out of an ordinary narrative temporality, I think, into the kind of realm that psychoanalysts in particular are likely to want to delve into. And when you get the second miles to go before I sleep, we know it's not sleep anymore, and it's not miles.
I'd add that form, in the sense on which you were focusing, genre, very often involves the sort of reader expectations we've been talking about. It's a sonnet, so we both expect certain things to happen, but also expect them to be challenged. One reason form is so interesting is it's always a dialogue between what's been done in the form before and what other poets do. When David Wojan writes sonnets about pop music, for example, he's very deliberately, as it were, riffing on the sonnets about love. When Tony Harrison writes what is sort of a sonnet about being a working class kid who's having trouble writing sonnets, again, there's a dialogue with all the other people in the form. Anybody else want to add to that question about form, either the audience or the panel, or other questions from the audience?
Come on up.
Yeah, hello, my name is Andre Spears. I'm a fiction writer and a poet, also a comparatist. I'd like to pick up on a comment that Ms. Dubrow made that I found very interesting. You sort of tossed it out. You said that dreams, and this is pertinent to our context, present elements of both lyric and narrative. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that. I wonder how the other members of the panel feel about that, and if they have any comments.
Okay. let me put it in a broader context. Then, since we are watching time, briefly in a narrow context, I'm interested in all kinds of forms that challenge the relationship between narrative and lyric, particularly by what they do with temporality. I mean, dream is something that's very present in the mind, and yet obviously often it involves a story, maybe a story that very consciously looks back to something in the past. This is part of a broader interest I have in temporality and references to the future, where again you may tell a story, but also a story that you're meditating on. So what interests me here is how various attitudes to time comment on form and complicate form. Anybody want to add to that?
Well, it seems to me, again, dream is a place where you can have these really rich interactions between narrative and lyric, and I think that bringing in the temporality also complicates it. But again, I wouldn't say that there's any sort of necessary relationship between dream and one mode or another, that you can have a whole variety within trying to think about, my own dreams.
I was actually thinking about poems on dream, but you're right that the question can also be rephrased.
Yeah. You want to say?
No, I am.
Okay.
Oh, here's a question.
Yeah, observation. Yeah, Beth Albin. I think this is my third time in this austere, wonderful place. Austere, warm at the same time. I kind of wanted to address the doctor's comments a little bit by just saying, as a unpublished working writer, and really just more interested in writing than I am in publishing, I feel that poetry gives you a chance to kind of objectify the confusion and sort of make nonsense of it instead of trying to make sense of it, really. I think we're actually working against sense when we write, because we have the reality, we've got to pay the bills and take care of the kids. But writing gives us a chance to really step off and really step away from all the rules. And I think the form of the narrative and how it works into poetry, it's just really clothing that we have to dismiss. Thank you.
Yeah, for me, those two are connected. The dream and the poetry is like formless in a sense, The dream is where I get to exercise what I lack in poetic, competence in the dream, I think. And what I try to do from the dreams is kind of recreate that language that I'm hearing in the dream, So for me, those two are connected. Coming from someone who had a series of bizarre dreams last night, trying to make sense of them up to this point. There were death and love all in the same place. It was scary. How to make sense of that in poem, that's for me always the challenge. And I like what you had to say about, there's a need for combustion almost.
And I think that when we can access the unconscious, and because we're restricted, like the events are kind of inhibiting. Okay, this happened, someone took a piss and someone broke his arm. But if we can get beyond that and get rid of the metaphor and really get into the unconscious and the unknown, I think the biggest compliment my husband gives me is like, he says, but you've never ever written anything like that before. Well, that's what I want. I want to go where I haven't gone before.
Sergei Sanger, a child psychiatrist, and I'm very interested in the role of narrative because children always want to know, what was it like before I was born? What was it like when I was little? And they revise those ideas, and it's a mark of health when a child can actually give a coherent story of what they went through. Children and parents who can't remember are in trouble, or can't at least form a reasonable narrative of how they came to be who they are. But that still gets revised all the time. And the children that can remember with feeling and act it out are in even better shape.
Thank you. I guess that seems to be it. Well, thank you very much.
Let me let me also express thanks to a woman who works for Philoctetes, Polly Rosenwake, who did a lot of the work in planning this panel. Thank you, Polly.